Hello, my friends. Today I have a true horror story that will pull you into a world of mystery and dark secrets. Imagine an old, forgotten place, filled with echoes from the past and haunting whispers in the shadows. This isn't just an ordinary ghost story, it's based on real events that left those who experienced it forever changed. So take a deep breath, turn down the lights, and keep your eyes wide open, because once you start, there's no turning back. The Haunted Mirror. In a small isolated town on the outskirts of New England, there stood an abandoned Victorian mansion known as the Howling House. Local legends had circulated for years that it was cursed, claiming that those who entered would never leave the same. The mansion's eerie reputation dated back to the 1930s when the Thompson family, its original owners, vanished without a trace. Neighbors who dared to peer into the mansion's windows claimed to see shadowy figures moving within, despite its apparent vacancy. By the 1980s, most of the town had moved away, and the mansion became a place of fascination and fear for thrill seekers. But it wasn't until the early 2000s that anyone dared to stay overnight. A man named David, a skeptic who hosted a popular ghost debunking YouTube channel, decided to document a night in the mansion. His channel was built on exposing myths, and he thought this house would be no different. He arrived with his girlfriend Claire, armed with cameras, voice recorders, and his skepticism. As David set up, he found himself drawn to a massive, ornate mirror in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The frame was wrought iron, and the mirror's surface had an unnatural shine, despite layers of dust everywhere else. It was as if the mirror had been freshly polished, and yet no fingerprints or smudges marred its surface. David shrugged it off as a trick of the light, but Claire seemed unsettled. She whispered that she felt like something was watching them, especially when they were near the mirror. Midnight approached, and the cameras were rolling. David and Claire began their usual tests, calling out into the silence and monitoring for cold spots, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. They waited for hours, but as the clock struck 3 a.m., David heard a faint tapping sound from upstairs, where the mirror was. When they reached the room, they saw it. Their reflections in the mirror weren't moving in sync. Claire was the first to notice her reflection lingering a half-second longer than her actual movement, her reflected hands still raised as she lowered it in real life. David tried to rationalize it, calling it an optical illusion or camera interference, but when he turned back to look at the mirror, the reflection had changed completely. Instead of his and Claire's faces, the mirror showed two other people, a woman in an old-fashioned gown and a man dressed in black. Their expressions were blank, but their eyes were hollow, filled with a strange darkness that seemed to pull David in. He stepped closer, captivated. Claire pulled him back, breaking his trance, and they hurried out of the room, slamming the door behind them. But as they turned to leave, the door slowly creaked open, and the mirror glowed faintly, as if lit from within. Desperate to understand what was happening, they reviewed the footage from their cameras. To their horror, the recordings had somehow captured voices whispering in the background. One voice repeated the word "help" in a pleading tone, while another, darker voice muttered, "never leave." Claire's face turned pale as she listened, convinced that the house was more than just haunted. She believed that something within it was trying to ensnare them, to trap them in the way it had trapped others before. Determined to get out, David and Claire decided to grab their equipment and leave. But as they descended the grand staircase, the front door slammed shut, locking them inside. Every attempt to open it failed, and the air grew heavy with the scent of something rotting. In a panic, they ran back upstairs, looking for an escape route. But when they passed the room with the mirror again, they saw something that stopped them dead in their tracks. The mirror now showed a hallway they hadn't seen before, a dark and endless corridor lined with flickering lanterns. The image was so real that they felt like they could walk right into it. Drawn by an unknown force, Claire stepped forward, reaching out her hand as if she could enter the mirror's world. David shouted for her to stop, but it was too late. The moment she touched the mirror, her body went rigid. Her eyes wide with terror as her reflection grinned back at her, mouthing words that only David could hear. "She's ours now." David pulled her away, but Claire was no longer the same. She barely spoke, her movements slow and robotic. Her eyes, once full of life, seemed hollow and lost. Desperate, David tried to escape the mansion with her, but every hallway twisted back on itself, leading them in circles. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time felt warped within those walls. Finally, they found an old cellar door that led to a tunnel. Crawling through it, David felt as though unseen hands were clawing at him, trying to pull him back. But with one final surge of will, he managed to pull Claire through and out onto the cold ground outside. They staggered back to his car and drove away without looking back. David's footage, however, told a different story. Reviewing it later, he discovered that the final moments in the mansion had not been recorded. Instead, there was only static, followed by one clear frame. The mirror, with their reflections still trapped within it, faces frozen in terror. Since that night, David has refused to speak of the house again. Claire, however, was never the same. Some say she would often be found staring into mirrors, as if waiting for something or someone to appear. Her once lively personality was replaced by an empty, haunted look, and she would often whisper to herself words David could not understand. Years later, David returned to the mansion, hoping to free whatever presence had claimed Claire's mind. But the house was gone. Only an empty plot remained, with no signs that anything had ever stood there. The mirror, too, had vanished. And yet, rumours persist that, in the right conditions, people still see the reflection of David and Claire in mirrors, wandering, lost and trapped in a world just beyond reach, forever haunting those who dare to look too closely. This story, whispered among locals as a cautionary tale, is said to hold a sliver of truth. After that terrifying night, David was never the same. Claire was gone, leaving him haunted by the memory of that cursed mirror. Some say that to this day, if you're brave enough, you might catch a glimpse of lost faces in old, dusty mirrors, as if they're waiting for someone to set them free. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the darkness holds secrets we just might uncover together.